Hello, good evening. Welcome to the Alaska State Museum. My name is Jackie Manning and I'm the curator of exhibits here at the museum. I am pleased to welcome you to this evening's lecture with artist Ben Huff. To start, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded land of the Auk peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Auk community, their elders both past and present, as well as future generations. The Alaska State Library's Archives and Museums acknowledges that Alaska was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. A few housekeeping items. This event is being recorded by KTOO 360 TV for later broadcast online at the APK. Please silence your cell phones. I will verify that mine is silenced. And we're going to ask that you wait until after Ben's lecture for questions, and we have a microphone set up right over there. It is my great pleasure to introduce Ben Huff. Ben is an artist and a photographer that lives here in Juneau. His last solo exhibit at the Alaska State Museum was in 2013, The Last Road North. That exhibit took us on a journey on the Dalton Highway from Fairbanks to Deadhorse near the Arctic Ocean. His exhibit that opened tonight, Atomic Island, takes us to Adak, an island in the Aleutians that I was surprised to learn is the southernmost community in Alaska. Atomic Island will be on exhibit at the museum through January 29th. Ben, thank you for being here.
Hi, everyone. This feels weird. I might take this off, maybe just for like lips and things, right? Or speaking up here. All vaccinated, got some distance. Feels really strange, but we're going to do that. Thank you for coming. I kind of didn't know what to expect tonight, right? It's been, this has been postponed now about a year. A couple other opportunities for this show to go elsewhere have stalled and sort of evaporated with COVID and sort of the big blackout of space in people's and institutions' schedule. So I'm incredibly thankful to the State Museum here for having me, for all of you coming out. I know it's been, I for one, I mean, my own work in the room aside, it was so nice to be in that space again. It'd been a really long time. So thanks for coming out. I really, really appreciate it. So I actually gave a talk kind of on this work a few years ago. I was on the board for a short period of time, and during my time on the board, we were working on some programming. And during Alaska Positive, which is the biannual photography juried exhibition, we did a series of lectures. We brought Brian and Ash Adams, wonderful photographers down from Anchorage. Chris Miller, who's poking around here somewhere tonight, he came and gave a talk. I sort of filled a hole and gave a lecture here that night as well. And I had just made one trip at that point out to Adak, and I kind of gave my impression of that first trip and that I was going to make this body of work. And kind of when I get something in my head, it kind of one way or another, for better or for worse, at some point it's kind of get nailed down, and this is it kind of getting nailed down. But I think at the time we talked a lot about process and kind of what I was going to do, and I think I did a lot of history. And today I'm going to try to, I didn't go back and look at that video because I can't do that, but I'm going to try to kind of go forward a little bit today and not kind of go back. So what I thought I would do today is, a lot of last time was a lot about sort of history and sort of photography in general, because I kind of had a little bit of time to fill because I hadn't really kind of dug in and made this work yet. My process as an artist is it's about location, but it's also sort of about overarching themes. The last time that I showed here was 2013. Jackie mentioned that with this project, The Last Road North. That project was the stretch of road that connects Fairbanks to the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay. And I kind of thought about that road and the pipeline as being this sort of metaphorical and physical line between wilderness and progress, right? It was this this landscape, this beautiful landscape that we had, co-opted for something. In this case, it was, bringing oil to other places in the country, other places in the world. When I was in Fairbanks and thinking about other portions of the state, thinking about other projects, I stumbled across in a roundabout way Adak and kind of stumbled across the contemporary life there post-World War II, post-Cold War. And decided in 08 that I would eventually make my way out there. In 2015, made my first trip. So a lot tonight, people sort of ask about why Adak, right? There's a lot of reasons, right? I think as a photographer, the built environment that's sort of crumbling in on itself, infrastructure. There's this sort of pull to some degree. I know a lot of photographers that are pulled to nature, right? They're pulled to landscapes that aren't about the people, the environment. I was thinking a lot lately, the aurora the Northern Lights display a couple nights ago. I hope all of you saw that to some degree. Like, it was just like spectacular, right? The things that bring us here or that keep us here, it's the Northern Lights, it's the mountains, it's the ocean, it's the glaciers, it's the wildlife, it's all of these things, right? Those things keep me here as well, but the things that interest me photographically are the things that we've brought to the place, right? I'm not responsible for the Northern Lights. I'm not responsible for, the salmon runs or the glaciers or all the things that I hold really, really dear. The things that I'm responsible for, that we're responsible for, are, that military infrastructure in the middle of the Aleutians, right? Or it's the pipeline coming down from Prudhoe Bay. And it's not to be cynical, it's not to be judgmental, the work isn't meant to be didactic, but I just have this want to look really honestly at places that are kind of past boom time, and especially with Adak, way past boom time, and sort of on the bus side of things. I recognized when I made that first trip that the pictures that I was making weren't enough to sort of fill in all the gaps that I needed, the things that I needed to show. I knew sort of intuitively on the first trip that I needed some archival pictures. I needed things to bring in that weren't even necessarily from Adak, but were from the World War II and the Cold War effort across the Aleutian chain. So the pictures of the down plain there on the North Shore, of the Canakin bomb and Chitka, the other images there that were out of the Alaska archives, some are out of the Anchorage archives, and some are out of the State Library archives. All of those were sort of brought in to not make a narrative that's necessarily a historical document that you're going to go into that space and learn anything other than sort of the surfaces that I've brought to the place. But it's more to talk about or to give a platform, a space for you, for me, for us, to go in and to sort of, reflect on a landscape, what we've ultimately done to the landscape, the reason why we were there, the idea that something is of grave, grave importance until someone decides that it's not important anymore, and sort of what that looks like when we walk away. This project was made between 2014 and 2019. There's a forthcoming book about the work as well, and I'm kind of, you'll know why I'm kind of segueing here for a second, but we very much hoped that the plan was all along to have the book for the opening tonight. COVID and publishers sitting on book projects, and then this summer finally saying now's the time, and trying to bring things to life, combined with a supply chain issue with paper, has kind of brought things not to a halt, but has delayed things substantially. But I wanted tonight to show more pictures of Adak and put it within context of two different ways of sort of telling the same story. We have the prints that are on the wall in the other room. Some of them are, I think, very specific, contain a lot of information. Some are maybe a little bit more lyrical. Some are there to be quite honest, to confound a bit, right? And all of that, I think, hopefully brings something together that provokes some sort of deeper excavation. But I wanted to show some pictures tonight that didn't make it in the other room to sort of broaden that lens a little bit. I would love to sort of make this maybe a little bit shorter than a normal lecture and open it up to some questions. I sort of enjoy that a lot more than maybe listening to myself go on up here as well. We're going to show some pictures, a few pictures within the context of the book, and kind of talk about ways that, you know, the experience of walking through an exhibition space. It was laid out to sort of, you know, turn to the left and sort of, you know, run from the left right, so it is that clockwise through the show. It was sort of designed to kind of run that way. It sort of started with military infrastructure, sort of bled a little bit into sort of administration to some degree, and kind of ended with neighborhoods and with people and the folks that are still there. The book largely does that as well. There's 3 different seascapes in the show. That sort of turning the back on the island and looking out at the horizon, where if there were conflict there closer to Adak, where that conflict would take place on that horizon. I wanted to share the first few sequences of, this is just a PDF of what the book will look like, just to sort of illustrate a different way of stepping out of the exhibition space and sort of imagine sitting in a chair with this object, and the experience of entering a landscape, entering, we'll call it a story for lack of a better term, entering it through that vehicle versus standing in an exhibition space. And the book actually starts with the very first image that's in the exhibition to the left, the aerial photograph, the archival photograph of Adak. And the book itself leads into 3 distinct, or 3 seascapes that are all the exact same place, just a few seconds apart from each other. So I don't start with a big view of the infrastructure. We don't start with specifics. We start with this repetition. We start with a sort of mood. We start with 3 pictures that are almost identical, but just changed just a little bit. It's kind of hard to see. There's a little bit of a gray outline, but you can kind of imagine that this is page spreads. So we start with something that's a little bit opaque, and then a seascape that's sort of framed within what we call the aspect ratio, or the actual size of the actual photographs that I'm taking. The first ones are elongated and cropped at the top and the bottom. And then we get to the first archival image. So if we sort of come to this work clean and we haven't seen anything before, that sequence, that sort of staging of how we go from that, you know, pink embossed text on the cover that doesn't give us an awful lot, and then kind of brings us through those images into the submarine. More infrastructure on Adak. A lot of questions tonight about how many people live there still. I haven't been out there in a couple years now. 2019, right before COVID hit, was my last trip to the island. At the time, about 75 full-time people were living on the island at the time. There was a cannery. Pacific Harvest was out there. It seemed to me at the time, and I haven't looked in the last couple years, but making a pretty good go of it. And they were bringing in 50 or so people to come in and run the cannery, which was, for the small Adak economy, kind of exploding it, which was kind of great to see. There were 3 other operations that had come through and tried to do crab. There was a halibut operation, and none of them lasted more than a season and folded up and left. But that's all to say that all of these buildings are completely abandoned, right? There hasn't been, this is an administration building. There hasn't been any activity in this building since 1997, when the Navy left after the Cold War. The thing, you know, the first impression, first getting to the island and driving around, I guess the first trip walking around, I didn't get a vehicle that first week. I just wanted to kind of be a little closer to the space, but like the sheer amount of waste is just like mind-blowing. There's barely a building out there that you could go out there right now and resurrect, right? It's all just complete garbage. So as a photographer, you could go out there and you could make, you know, a sort of horror show sort of pictures, right? There was a time where I was sort of making a lot of things initially at night, and everything was sort of spooky, and I decided to sort of make it a little bit brighter, even though the subject matter is a little stark. This is the bombing at Dutch Harbor. So this is the thing that I think set me off at the beginning when I was first looking through that book by Cohen, The Forgotten War, that had me initially led me to Adak. I'm not necessarily a history buff, right? The military history is interesting to me to a point to sort of get the feel that I want from the pictures. But the bombing of Dutch Harbor and the Forgotten War, they call it, or the whole Aleutian campaign in general, was not something that I was taught in school in Iowa, right? Like, it was not part of my World War II history at all. But this is, yeah, this is the bombing at Dutch Harbor. I found myself over and over and over making pictures of doors. A lot of times, you know, you make the pictures, you sort of trust your gut, you trust your intuition. You don't try to overthink it and say, why am I doing this or why am I doing that? Just if it clicks, if you're drawn to it, if you find that it's interesting, it could be subject, it could be feeling, it could be color, it could be texture, it could be line. I mean, it could be a myriad of things. And then I think the art really happens, if you call it art, the art happens at the editing table, right? The art happens at the end of not necessarily what you bring in, the pictures that you bring in, but the pictures you leave out, right? The things that you subtract, the things that you cull. But doors found themselves over and over again, and it becomes this sort of a bit of a theme that runs through the book as a whole. This is a landscape, obviously on Adak, right? All the color pictures are on Adak. I was very struck by this landscape. It's eerily similar to, there's actually another view of the bombing at Dutch Harbor too, where the silhouette of the sky is very, very similar. The silhouette of the landscape is very, very similar. I'm drawn to stark, right? Drawn to melancholy. I just can't sort of fight it. The inclusion of archival images, some of them have come from the State Library here, some of them came from the Anchorage archives. Some I just sourced offline, found them, and just kind of fell in love with them and had to have them, and you know, bought them from different stock agencies. Just a couple of them that I just couldn't find images that I wanted in the archives here in Alaska. But all of them pointing to a history, sort of pointing to a conflict, but making pictures that I just couldn't make on my own. Texture and color. There's a lot of art, a lot of drawings, a lot of like contemporary hieroglyphics, right, of people sort of staking their claim. In some cases, kind of hard to sort of parse the things that are interesting and in this particularly sort of interesting and of sort of this Cold War era, and stuff that's just demolished and garbage by, you know, people that have come through, be it, you know, fishermen or hunters or whoever have come through, and just because it's on the edge of nowhere and there's no cops, and other than the, you know, the small 8.5 by 11 signs saying "keep out" that are on bad copy paper and up in, you know, up on with packing tape. Like, no one's there really keeping anyone from going in anything. Everything is just just destroyed. I mean, just every building, every window, every room, chairs through doors, chairs through walls, fists through things, feces on walls, just, I mean, metaphorical and literal shit everywhere. And it's, in some ways, it's sort of dispiriting and it's sort of sad. And you could go out there and make a catalog of that, right? I could make millions and millions of pictures on that. The trick often was to try to sort of cut through the garbage and find something that was, hopeful is not the word, but something that was, it could all be honest, I guess, but this came out of the Anchorage archives. So some of these pictures, such little information other than the pictures themselves. This wouldn't have been Adak. My guess is that road is in Kiska, but all those pockmarks of bombs, right? Over and over and over. You know, I grew up, the first images that I ever saw, right, were probably like everybody that didn't grow up here, right? I grew up in Iowa, moved to Colorado, where my wife and I were for 10 or so years. We moved to Fairbanks in '05. But sort of, you know, Alaska for me was, you know, National Geographic magazine, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's completely legitimate. But I'm interested in these places that we've touched. That whole hillside had Quonsets on it. All those little, each one of those little depressions had a Quonset on it at one point. It was right above the harbor. There's 4 different distinct neighborhoods in Adak. The main, that's when all the flyers, the blue, kind of the very early morning sort of blue landscape with all the little candy-colored houses. That's the Kullik neighborhood. Within that frame at the time, at the very center, there's one house, a little blue bucket on the stovepipe, and that belongs to a gentleman that I'm becoming friends with, Larry Hodge, the portrait of Larry in there, that's Larry and his dog Sancho. He lived in that house just in the summers. Off to the right of the frame, out of the frame, there's a couple other houses that have people living in them. They're there full time. And then just past on the right, this is the turnkey neighborhood, completely abandoned, no one in these. The 2-story buildings, which was Bayshore, which is another picture in the other room with all the walls blown off. Nobody lives in those neighborhoods at all. And then there's Sandy Cove, which was the one with the van sitting in the parking lot. Predominantly, most everyone that lives in town lives in that neighborhood. But all of them very, very 70s, very distinctly different architecture, different neighborhoods. These are actually probably the ones that have held up the most in the weather, but they're completely abandoned and ripped up inside and essentially garbage. You could do a whole project of inventory of chairs and beds and mattresses, and there's a whole building. I've got some pictures that, some things I made pictures of over and over and over again, and they were wonderful in theory. They're wonderful stories, wonderful ideas, but I just couldn't make pictures that sort of worked. But there was a whole building that was just full of chairs and bed frames. Like they just emptied out a bunch of other buildings and just put them in another one, right? Like maybe they were going to move them off the island. Maybe it was just to keep, I don't know, people busy to give them a job, but they just moved stuff from one spot to another over and over and over again. There's a lot of pink in the book. Hans Gremmen, the designer of the book, who is absolutely brilliant, and I'm very lucky to have had him take this project on and picked up sort of on that pink on the cover, but over and over and over again, pink, pink, pink. And this again is there in Bayshore. One of the archival bits that I found in the Anchorage library was this old brochure of a brochure for the housing when it was new, like in the 70s. All these wonderful pictures of these houses when they weren't destroyed, right? And it says, finished quarters before the ladies' touch, which is just so ridiculously, horribly wonderful for the 70s. A letter that I found in one of the houses in a kitchen drawer for the housing manager welcoming people to Adak. And then the portraits. The portraits exist all same way that I sort of dealt with them in the exhibition. If you came in and went to the right, that's perfectly fine. I mean, it works either way, but the portraits always sort of existed toward the end of the project. I made physical mock-ups of the book before I went and found the publisher, FW Books, and Hans Gremmen, who designs it. And I had two different versions, two different physical mock-ups of the book, and I sent in PDFs of both. One was sort of portraits interspersed throughout the entire book from beginning to end. One was sort of chapters. There was sort of military in the first chapter and sort of housing and portraits in the second chapter. And he came back with this, after we kind of back and forth of what I was struggling with and how I was having a hard time incorporating sort of, contemporary portraits and people that were living in this space that didn't have any connection with the military. It all come in after 1997, right? They're living amongst all of this, detritus of that effort, but they weren't part of it, right? Like it was part of their contemporary life of being all this stuff. But there wasn't a personal necessarily connection between the military and them. What we did was we made it's not a separate booklet, but it's a different weight of paper. It's a different scale. It sits back about 4/5 of the way through the book, and it almost feels as though it's stitched in, but it almost feels as though you could take it out of the book, right? That sort of feeling that I had, that I always look at ADN all the time, and I'm like, one day I'm going to wake up and I'm just going to hear that Alaska Airlines isn't going to fly anymore, and everybody flew off the island, and Adak's done, and I wouldn't even think anything of it. I'd say that sounds about right? Like it just feels like that. And the portraits sit in the book in a way that they almost feel as though you could take them out and the book works. It seems not temporary, but there's something very fragile about them. And then we end with a couple just sort of unpeopled, almost sweet landscapes. Every time someone sees this, they ask me about surfing in Adak. I'm sure people have. That's about 4 feet there or so. It'll be definitely enough to get on top of if you knew what you were doing. Let's do this. I've just got a couple pictures of some things that I'm working on right now that I thought maybe I just kind of throw out there. It seems like every time I stand up here, I say, oh, now I'm doing this, and then once I say it out there and I say it outside of my head, then I kind of have to do it. So it's happened 3 times now at this podium that I said, oh, now I'm working on this, and then I've had to go out and suck it up and get it done. But a couple things that I'm working on right now, just really quickly, and then we'll open it up to questions as we're going. I don't want to go long here, but first of all, let's deal with this first. Sorry, I forgot this was here. Jackie and Aaron so wonderfully put together. As you walked in, there's the Ben Huff Atomic Island, and there's that wonderful little cutout of the island itself. And behind there running is this video. The video is a tape. Is a reel that I found on the island in a building of, what do we look at, the Star Spangled Banner, right? And apparently they used to splice this in at the beginning of like theatrical releases, like if someone was going to see, if they were there now and they were going to see, the new Bond film, right? They would splice this in the beginning, and the soldiers would stand, hand over heart and sing along. And the video was kind of so great, and I kind of wanted to incorporate it somehow in the book. And Hans split it up into stills and made this separate little book of just the film stills from this video. that will be a separate little book that'll be kind of tucked in the back. There's not a lot of there's actually only one other American flag in the whole book. And then this video is just over and over and over. This last sequence, this last picture, the last sequence is just, flag after flag after flag, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller in the distance, which is a nice sort of kind of coda for what I was thematically kind of what I was looking at anyway. So a couple things here close to home. I have been, a lot of kind of what I'm doing is always going somewhere else, right? When I was in Fairbanks, and then we moved to Jono, and I was still working on the last road north, on the Hall Road up north, and going away, the phone doesn't work. I've got several days, a week, 2 weeks, whatever the time is, to just to work and to put my head down and to get rid of distractions and just think about things and just get all wrapped around the axle about stuff and just make work and try to sort of, try to check all the boxes on all this thing that I'm trying to make, whether it's the last road north, going to Adak with Atomic Island, flying all the way out there. And especially since COVID, and a lot of other little reasons, but I've been wanting to try to find a way to make work closer to home. I had an exhibition in February of 19, right before everything went to hell with COVID, up at the City Museum with this project I was working on called The Light That Got Lost. It's been derailed a little bit because of COVID, and this is the only picture I'm going to show because this glacier that's poking out here above Suicide Basin almost looks like an angel. And I'm not a religious man at all, but it's become this wonderful little piece to me because that whole project, I'm kind of burning the circuit board and rethinking everything and just sort of going back to the beginning and trying to rework how I'm trying to tell whatever story I'm trying to tell there. So this I have pinned up in the studio just as I don't know, just to kind of tell me to chill out and not rush it and let the process work itself out. And anyway, so Light That Got Lost is something that I'm working on up in the Juneau Ice Field, specifically with the Juneau Ice Field Research Program. And then to kind of get locally here for just a second, then we'll open up for questions. I started making work, I make work here all the time, right? But sometimes with much more intent than others. And about the time that I went to Adak, I was really sort of making pictures with some urgency here in Juneau, and thinking about certain things and thinking about Juneau being, built on gold, and we've got the seat of government here and tourism and money and all that kind of stuff. And then I went to Adak, and I have a hard time. I have a very limited emotional bandwidth to work on too many things at once of these kinds of projects, like multi-year kind of. I just get all wrapped up in kind of obsessive. And I've gone back to this work, looking at old pictures, but now starting to make new pictures. I just wanted to share a few. These go back a little ways. These are all like 2015, 2016. I have a lot of film right now that still needs to be processed, but just a really quick sneak peek of kind of what I'm thinking about right now, and then we'll open it up to questions. I couldn't tell you entirely. Couldn't even tell you entirely what I'm doing. I love this stage of starting something new or coming back to something and just kind of starting to put the pieces together. Being excited is important. Okay. God, that seemed really fast and all over the place. I hope it didn't feel like that out there. But let's, we got a few minutes left. You want to open up for questions, Jackie? Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. Anyone? Don't be shy. It can be about anything. Oh, Anari, go for it.
It's not actually quite a question.
Oh, okay.
I'm wondering how you feel about your last work, Last Road North,
Mm-hmm.
and your the Adak Island project.
Yep.
Because in some ways they're very different. And you live in Fairbanks and you can drive the whole road, and it's bustling. There's trucks and there's things, and it's alive and there's people. And then you go to Adak and there's 75 people living there, and it's all sort of distant in the past, and everything is crumbling down. So do you see that those two projects, do they have some things that come together in some ways? Or are they completely living in a different world?
I feel like there's some overlap for sure. I feel like there's some thematic overlap. I mean, the things that I'm interested in thinking about have sort of driven me to both places, you know. I don't think they look the same, right? Like they're distinctly different landscapes. The different cameras, which I hate talking about cameras, but they're two different things for sure. But a lot of the thing that I think about the people landscape and the idea of boom and bust and the idea of the exploitation of the landscape, like that's all there to some degree, you know. The one thing that is similar that I actually, it wasn't even until the editing that I kind of started to put it together, was there are more people there in Adak in the summer that are either contractors there. There's still some unexploded ordnance being removed from the north of the island. There's some, you know, other federal organizations that come through and do some things, and there's, you know, odds and ends of people coming through in the summertime. And with the haul road, with the last road north, I very specifically, I made pictures of truckers while I was making that work. And eventually I stopped, and none of them ever made it into the book or into the exhibition. I was more interested in the people that were there because they wanted to be there. This idea of driving, you know, to the end of the continent because they could, right? Versus the people that were there because they had to be. And Adak's the same way, right? Like all those portraits are people that for whatever reason, for different stories, have chosen to make a go of it there. And that's not something that maybe you would know by looking at the pictures. Like that's all just sort of internally. But that's a connection, I guess. They're all very small. Yeah, good question. Thanks.
I'm interested in how many images you take of a scene. For example, you were showing us one or two doors. Did you take one or two pictures of that door that you showed us, or did you take 100 pictures? And the portraits of Kat and I think Chris, who had the smoking.
Yeah, Simon. Yeah.
Or Simon. And
yep.
Just a quick snap that, and then you like the picture, or are you taking many, many images and reframing and reorganizing it in your mind? So I'm just wondering how many pictures you take to get an image you like.
That's a good question. I'm kind of frugal. This film was all shot with a digital camera. The last road north, and this last little bit that I showed was all a mix. But I kind of come from, how do I say this? My instincts as a photographer come from when I was using film and still didn't have a lot of money, but didn't have a lot of money. And I was really, really frugal, right? Because every shot was going to cost me a few bucks. And I still deal that way quite a bit. With portraits, I got one shot to get it right. You know, like I'm not going to go back and ask somebody, well, there's a couple people on the island that maybe I made a couple portraits of them a couple times, but I know that sitting there, like I got to get this right for them and for me, and I'm probably not going to get another crack at it. And I may very well, you know, sit here, stand there, let's go inside, let's go outside. There's some of that for sure to try to find the thing that I'm looking for. With the landscapes and the architecture, it's kind of two answers, right? In that the beauty of, and everything's very compact. There's a lot of things, like I may make a picture of a building and only make one or two pictures of it at that time. But a lot of times I'm thinking about it like, this is really wonderful. I bet it's great during this time of day. And I'll go back and make it again under different lighting. So oftentimes I'll go back and back and back. The sort of the picture that's on the brochure of the Cullick neighborhood where it's all sort of blue, I'm standing on the sort of a hill where the water tower is, and I took a picture. You can kind of walk off at lower elevations on either side of that hill. And I've stood in roughly that same space and made, I don't know, a dozen different pictures at different times a day. And it just, like, the perspective's great. You can see all the neighborhoods, you know, like it's so much is crammed into that. But that morning after it had just snowed, like the light was spectacular, but, you know, you can't see any stovepipe smoke. There's no tracks in the new snow on the ground. You know, there's no boats on the horizon in the harbor. Like there was so many little pieces that pointed to the fact that, like, no one's there. You know, there's so much more information in that capture than the 10 other times I made from almost that same spot. It was the light and it was the snow, all kind of little nuances of qualities that I just hadn't gotten before. Yeah, good question. Anyone else? Yeah, John.
So you named it the Atomic Island.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the thinking process there? Because it's not clear just going through the exhibit or going through your book. Yeah,
for sure. Absolutely. It's a good question. So much of that early allure was, like, the book's not about nostalgia. It's not about me. But I think initially, sometimes with photography, there's the excitement of kind of what you might unearth. And that place and the Cold War history of that place, kind of two parts of the answer here, made me think of so many things when I was growing up, you know, films and, you know, Red Dawn and war games and all that kind of crap, right? There was sort of that idea of, you know, kind of the Red Scare and duck and cover drills, and I grew up in a conservative family in Iowa, right? Like there's just so sort of, there's something very kind of heavy about that time, right? There's the picture of Kannakin, right, which someone reminded me tonight is just coming up on the anniversary. It was like the early 70s where they detonated the atomic bomb out of Mchitko, which is just west of Adak. And there were nuclear warheads housed in the Seven Doors of Doom, which is the first big picture you see there on the left wall. So there were nuclear warheads on the island, right? They weren't deployed right there in combat in the vicinity. But that idea of that time and sort of the tenor of the nuclear bomb after World War II, right? The picture of the last scene of Dr. Strangelove there at Joe's place, which I took on a day that was so windy I couldn't even leave the house, and I was just casting around trying to do things inside. And I love that film, and I used to take it with me and watch it at night. And I'm like, oh, this is, anyway. And the name Atomic Island, like, I'm sort of drawn to things that are a little bit more lyrical, right? Like, there were a few other titles that I kind of had casting around, and I got to the point where and Hans did this with the cover too, making it very sort of graphic. But there's something about, like, Atomic Island is so sort of percussive and sort of aggressive and a little bit harsh. And I liked that about it. So there's a lot of little things that sort of feed into kind of a bigger thing. Yeah. Anyone else? Please.
So in your travels out west, did you ever stop in Anchorage and talk to folks with the Aleut Corporation who are trying to reclaim that property and land and talk about their vision for the future of that neighborhood? Not in Anchorage, no. I mean, there are Aleut Corp reps in Anchorage, and I've talked to them, a little bit briefly, but not enough.
Yeah, probably not enough to really speak to here, right? So a little bit about that, right? So the Navy sold all of that to the Alu Corp, and well, like, probably later, 98, 95, probably later than that, right? But the Navy left in 97, and other than the Navy cleaning up some things there, it's owned by the Alu Corp, and there's a lot of talk just by people on the island of what may or may not be of that place. But I don't know enough to maybe, put myself out there right now on it. I will say that it's, I love that place. I love the people that I met there. I don't know that I'll ever find myself back there again. It's not a place you sort of pass through, I love the kids out there. I spent a little bit of time in the school there when I was there. They were great. But I find it really hard to believe that, fishing, the cannery still is, or at least could be operational again, but there's not a building out there you could move something into tomorrow and, plug in a computer and have it go, right? Like it's a mess. God love them, right? Like if they can make something work out there. Yeah. Which isn't really an answer to your question, but it's the best I can do. Anybody else? Lisa?
Question.
Yeah.
Photographs are so deceiving. You can't
Totally.
tell how vast a place is.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious about the size of the footprint on Adak of
Mm-hmm.
all of that naval installation. And
Mm.
then something else that struck me. One of the pictures that led me to think about it was the one where the Quonset huts were.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden you think about the size of a Quonset hut. And,
Yeah.
And back to that, just the size, if you can give me a sense of.
Yeah,
the
so
space.
let's see here. So so this is as far as you can't drive right to here, but this is kind of off the road on the south end of the island. And from there to, there's not a picture on the wall in there, but the Loran station on the north end, from there to there is probably, I guess it's probably 12 miles. And then across to Shagak Bay, which is the big white landscape on the backside. That from downtown is probably maybe 5 miles the other direction, 5 or 6 miles. So yeah, 15 by 6-ish. For the town is. The town is the size of Douglas, right? But all the military infrastructure is probably scattered roughly that perimeter. Yeah, roughly, right? Your comment about photographs being deceiving, right? Like, this is the thing that as a photographer, it's the reason I make pictures and I don't do something else, right? Like it's that mystery is like everything, right? Like photography is strip away everything else, right? Like it's just the recording of surfaces. That's it, right? Like it's an honest read back of what's physically there, right? Like the best that I can do with this work, to say honesty-wise, is like that happened. Like that landscape's there. That person sat with me on the other side of the table, right? So then all that other bit of captions and anecdotes and what I leave into the work and what I take out, like that's what's so infinitely fascinating and troublesome and difficult, right? Like it's just so, I'm not, and it makes it difficult, I think, not difficult, but I find it interesting making the kind of work that I make, right? That it's very straight photography. It's similar to journalism, but it's not journalism at all, right? Me as a viewer, okay, if I step out of the photographer role for a second and I think about myself as a viewer, an appreciator of photography, my expectations of a journalist and my expectations of an artist are completely different, right? Like the contract is different, If I read a story about Adak and a photographer has made pictures to illustrate that story, there's a compact with me and those people that what they're telling me is truthful, right? At the end of the day, they're probably telling me A, B, and C. A, B, and C happened, and you should think this, or we think this, or we found this. Art is so much more open than that. You know, the sequence of how I put things on the wall, whether we bring archival images in or bring them out, how much text is involved. And none of that is meant to be deceiving or to pull the wool over or anything like that, but it's all just, yeah, you're just playing with surfaces, and with those surfaces trying to find something that's not just surfaces, right? Which sounds so corny coming out of my mouth, but anyway, that sounds so ridiculous. But anybody else, another question? No? Henry? Yeah.
I just wanted to respond partly that, you know, sounding ridiculous is why we're all here today, right?
Yes. Being an artist is sort of ridiculous. It's kind of what I do. Yeah.
But I was really thinking that you explicated so much the relation of the garbage and history and nature together. And then to me, there's just this hanging question about these photos of doors that you just kept taking. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could say anything more about what you experienced with that aspect.
Of the doors in particular?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, doors just photographically, right? Doors are so loaded, you know? Like if we went back and just sort of looked at just the history of photography and, you know, the great photographers, I mean, doors are everywhere, right? Like it's sort of photography, right? It's this passage from, you know, somewhere to somewhere else, right? I love line. I love, you know, perfect corners. I love the way a perfect line of something architecture-wise lays perfectly up against a frame, right? Like something like just super basic visual like that, right? But with a work like this too, I think there's, and I can't say that I set out to do this particularly, right? I mean, so much of it is just intuitive because I'm looking for certain things, but yeah, I mean, I think you can't help but sort of, when you look at things like doors and think about them, you know, not from a physical standpoint, but from a metaphorical standpoint, right? This, you know, that place is in transition, right? Going from one place to another, right? Certainly with World War II, it was a necessary effort, right? Taking on the Cold War, or I don't know, you know, right? Like there's all sorts of you know, metaphors for, you know, for walking through that door. But not to say that that was something that I was specifically, you know, so much of it's intuitive is maybe not the right word, but something more akin to that than maybe intellectual. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah, John. Please, of course, yeah. Please.
So I got to thinking, visiting McKinnicott and McCarthy.
Yeah.
So here you've got a national park where we're preserving the part of history and got all these old things. And then when it struck you that here we are, part of our history of Alaska and certainly our nation, it's just all being destroyed. And
yeah.
Real kept. So I guess I just wanted to know what went on in your mind considering that kind of thing. I mean, the fact that it isn't being kept and remembered and so on. So
totally. I thanks for the question. I think the photo of Bering Hill in there, again, I'm not a religious guy by any means, but that old wooden church that's at the you know, the kind of the foreground of that Bering Hill picture, you know, every time I went out there, there was something else missing, right? That, you know, when I first went out there, you could walk on that floor, and now, I mean, you step foot on there, you'd be gone, right? Like, it's just the fact that that's folding in on itself is, I don't know, travesty, right? You know, again, sort of this idea of like documentary or being a journalist and being an artist. I think of my work as not, it's certainly like of its time, you know, like it's of this time, you know, in 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, you know, it'll be sort of time stamped to some degree, but it's not sort of about a specific event, right? But I do with the political climate right now and COVID and budgets and everything else, right? It feels, there's something about it, you know, the sort of end of the world feeling is a little on the nose, but there's, you know, yeah, there's something there that's palpable, right? Or relatable, I should say. But yeah, I think there is this idea of protecting, you know, this idea of what we think is important, right? You know, the oil fields, right? The last road north. I mean, you know, those oil fields at Prudhoe Bay, you know, they're of vital importance now too, but sooner or later they're not going to be of vital importance, you know, and, you know, a corporation up there will buy that space, right? And Exxon, everybody will walk away from it. You know, it's sort of baked in. You know, I mean, we have the same problems of the West. We're just 20 years late, right? But you know, the Alaska, this, you know, come up and, you know, get everything you can as fast as you can and get out, right? Like there's still so much of that mentality, right? You know, the military and Adak. Not to say that it wasn't a worthy effort by any stretch, but the military and Adak, you know, the oil companies in Prudhoe, right? Like it's that same idea, just on a, you know, on a massive scale. That's getting, you know, a little more political probably than I need to be, but yeah. Anyone else? No? Okay. I think we're over our time. Thank you so much, guys. I really, really, really appreciate you guys coming out. Thank you. Thank you.